Maya Ruiz woke before the sun. The trailer park was quiet then, the kind of quiet that sits heavy like a blanket. She moved softly so Elias would not wake. He slept with one small arm thrown over the side of his bed, his baseball cap folded on the pillow as if it, too, were tucked in. Maya paused at the doorway and watched him breathe. She touched his hair the way mothers do, quick, careful, full of things left unsaid, and left a short note on the kitchen table. It was the sort of note she left for small errands, gone to market. Back soon. Maya. She folded it once, slid it under a coffee cup, and kissed the top of Elias's head before she walked out. The morning smelled of damp earth and motor oil. The trailer sat near a narrow canal that wound into the Everglades. Palmetto leaves snapped in a small wind. Her neighbor waved from across the gravel. People in the park knew one another by the way they mended fences and shared sugar. Maya had lived there 3 years. She liked the place because it was close to the water and close to the work she loved. She worked as a guide for a tiny eco-tour company that ran airboat rides and short lessons about birds, orchids, and swamp life. She loved the swamp the way some people love a library. It replied to attention. She could tell which birds nested where by the scratch on a tree. She could read the color of the water and know which animals had passed through in the night. Elias was 10. He had the kind of small, certain features that made him look older than he was and younger than he wanted. He loved model airplanes and could draw any bird he had ever seen while Maya named it for him. Maya saved every spare dollar for his shoes and his small pleasures. She balanced her life very carefully: work, school run, paying bills, checking the little leaks in the trailer's plumbing. She was practical, patient, and careful. People who met her at the docks remembered her quiet laugh and the way she always handed you a towel if you were wet from the boat spray. She kept routine as if it were a rope to hold onto. On the morning the note sat on the table, Maya took her small camera and a thermos. The tourists were a family from out of state, bright with a holiday mood and a soft trust in the people who ran the tours. Maya greeted them with the kind of calm that made strangers relax. She checked the motor. She waved to Jared, another guide, who tipped his cap from his own boat. The sun rose on water that looked like glass until the airboats made lines across it. Maya pointed out a blue heron, a slowback turtle, and a patch of orchids that hid like secrets among roots. She took a short video of the family laughing, the light catching their smiles. She liked to save those small moments. They were proof to her that life could be ordinary and kind. The canals had thin places where the tall grass closed like a mouth. As they passed one narrow slough, Maya slowed the boat. On the bank someone had set a small camp. 3 men sat there beside a truck with a flat tire. They had the look of people who had been through a lot, old boots caked in mud, a lean that comes when you sleep on hard ground, a grin that did not reach the eyes. One of the men waved, but it was a quick, small motion. Maya said hello and felt something tighten in her chest for a beat that she could not name. Then she told herself to breathe. There were rough men in the Everglades. There were storms and long drives and people who lived on the edge. She kept the tour bright and professional and steered the boat back into the open channel. After the tour she parked the boat and waved the family off. The tourists left small bills and big thanks. Maya locked up the equipment and walked the plank to the trailer. She planned to run a quick errand, buy bread, check the post, return by noon. She told Elias she would be back and ruffled his hair. She left the note as she had done 100 times, put her keys in the pocket of her jacket, and closed the door behind her. Hours passed. Elias waited and watched the front window. He paced the small living room and then sat very still so the clock could not hear him. He finished his cereal even though he did not want to. He checked the back door and the kitchen sink. When the sun slid toward late afternoon and his mother did not return, his worry made a small, tight thing in his chest. He asked the neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, when she came by with a casserole. Mrs. Delgado knocked and called softly. Nobody answered. She opened the door and found the note on the table and Maya's keys on the hook. She dialed the sheriff. The first hours of any missing persons case feel stretched and thin. People fill them with tasks. The sheriff's deputies came with flashlights and proof sheets. They asked questions in quiet rooms and wrote down exact times. Volunteers gathered at the trailer park. Search teams pushed into the marsh with long poles and hopes that bent like reeds in the wind. Dogs ran along the banks, nose to mud, then came back empty-mouthed. Drones hummed in the sky, tiny wasps with cameras, finding turtle nests and old tires and the occasional lost hat, but not what they sought. Rangers checked the usual places where people lost their way: a narrow canal bend, an abandoned hunting blind, a stand of sawgrass that could hide a man. They pulled nets in the deeper channels and chased the water line with questions. People in the trailer park remembered things in different ways. Some said they had seen her that morning, bright and determined. Others said they had heard her laugh as she left. A neighbor mentioned seeing the men with the flat tire truck at the dock, but he said it like he was passing along a weather report. Rumors filled the spaces where proof had not yet reached. Some whispered that Maya had left because the rent had been late. Some suggested she had gone because she was tired and needed a new life. Others said she had run into trouble with the men who came through the marsh. Elias, who was too young to make theories, sat with a deputy and drew pictures of his mother. He would say, "She'll be back," like a prayer. He held the note under his pillow. The sheriff's office moved fast at first, then steady. The missing person report turned into search grids and then into a broader case when the city press pulled in. Flyers with Maya's smiling face went up in gas stations and laundromats. People in neighboring towns called. Strangers left messages on the sheriff's line. The conservation group that ran some guided trips joined the search, offering infrared cameras and lessons on where the water might hold human heat. The Everglades are wide and patient. They hide things with a skill that can tire even the most stubborn searcher. A small camera sat on the dock, its battery flat. A phone was found in the glove box of someone's truck with a dead battery and a screen smeared with mud. Nothing screamed of a struggle. The trailer showed no sign of forced entry. That absence of signs made the case heavier, like a closed book whose pages could not be opened. People started to make lists in their heads of possible endings, but the list stayed private. The sheriff talked about protocols and the limits of proof in the kindest voice he could manage. Volunteers took shifts in the heat and the rain. Children from the park made bracelets and left them on the porch. Elias learned to make coffee weak and to tie his own shoelaces. He learned to sleep with the note folded under his pillow. Grief, when it comes to places like the Everglades, has a long horizon. The marsh goes on as it always does, birds land and lift, the water shifts its face, and small animals forage and do not know about human absence. Neighbors lit candles the first night and left casseroles the week after. The sheriff's team came back again and again, sometimes with a tip that led to a dead end and sometimes with nothing at all. The men with the flat tire truck left a shadow in people's memories. Someone said one of them carried a silver case and that it had been heavy. Jared, the guide, kept replaying the day in his head. He thought about the smile that did not reach the eyes and about the way Maya had slowed near the camp. He wondered if he had missed a detail that would have changed everything. As the first week closed, the frantic searching gave way to a slow, hopeful waiting. The search lists got shorter, but the calls to the sheriff did not stop. Friends took Elias to school. Mrs. Delgado sat with him in the evenings and read him the stories Maya used to read. At the same time, life demanded its small dues, rent notices came, and work shifts continued for others. The world had the strange habit of moving forward even when a life had been made into a missing person poster. The Everglades kept its own counsel, the water turned under sun and moon, and a small boy slept with a note and a name pressed to his chest. Time braided itself into a long, patient thing after Maya vanished. Days became small tasks for Elias: school, homework, a phone call to the sheriff when he could, but the weeks felt like a single, slow day that did not end. Volunteers came in waves. Some stayed a few hours and then went home to their own lives. Others slept in cars at the trailer park and woke early to walk muddy banks until their boots filled with water. The search had a rhythm: rise with the sun, check the marsh, mark what was found, and promise to return. The Everglades answered in its own way, sometimes with a flash of wings, sometimes with only the hollow sound of distant water against a log. Miguel Ortega, the park ranger who knew the swamp like the lines of his own hands, led many of the searches. He moved slowly and with a careful purpose. He taught new volunteers how to read the marsh, where the reeds grew thick, where the mud held patterns like old maps, where an animal path might cut between two stands of sawgrass. He showed them how to listen for small sounds, a scraping that might mean a hidden trail or the soft slap of a creature moving through shallow water. Miguel believed that the Everglades did not lose things forever, it sometimes hid them. His faith kept teams returning to places other people had decided were finished. The sheriff's office refined the case. At first the lines on the missing person poster were new news, then they blurred into paperwork and interviews. Deputies went door to door with questions that sounded ordinary but were aimed to catch oddness. What did she buy at the market? Did she seem different lately? Did she argue with anyone? The answers were a mixture of certainty and guesswork. Neighbors remembered seeing Maya with groceries, remembered her laugh, remembered the way she watched Elias on the school run. Others said she had been quiet for a few days, concerned about bills. The sheriff wrote it all down. A team from a conservation group lent tools that the sheriff did not have: infrared cameras, a drone with a steady humming eye, and a woman named Lena who had a gift for tracking small human signs in wild places. Lena had worked on other recoveries and had a patience for thin leads. She flew the drone at low altitude on a clear morning and watched the live feed for differences in heat that human bodies might show. The drone found turtle nests and an abandoned cooler, a small boat half hidden under mangroves, and a long line of crushed grasses where something had been dragged. Each find was photographed and added to a growing stack of evidence that might one day form a map. The men at the camp near the slough did not vanish from people's minds. They continued to come and go in their battered truck. People watched them like a weather pattern, present and unchangeable. Jared, the other airboat guide, spoke less and thought more about the day they had passed the men. He remembered the flat tire and the silver case he had glimpsed under a tarp. He thought about small details that did not fit together, like a puzzle with a missing piece. Fear was a quiet thing in Jared. He did not want trouble. The swamp had rules of its own, and much of the community had learned to respect those rules, even when they seemed to side with silence. As the searches stretched, small moments of hope came and went. Once a fisherman in a borrowed skiff reported a wet shoe hung on a mangrove root. Volunteers dragged the water and found only an old boot, full of mud and mosquitoes. Another time a dog team ran to a reed bed and scratched wildly at the ground, then lay down exhausted. The handler swore the dog had picked up a scent, but the scent trailed to nothing. People sobbed with relief and then held on to that relief like something too fragile to show in the open. Elias felt each day as if he carried a small stone in his chest that grew heavier at dusk. He slept with the folded note under his pillow and watched the window for headlights. School was a place where he could be a boy for a few hours. Teachers kept an eye on him and gave him tasks that let him breathe. Mrs. Delgado, who lived 2 trailers away, became his evening anchor. She cooked meals and read stories Maya used to read. When Elias could not sleep, she would sit quietly in the living room and let him talk in fits and starts about birds or about how the marsh smelled after rain. He told her about the orchids his mother had shown him and about the sound of the airboat motors. He told her about the way Maya hummed while she threaded Elias's shoelaces. Talking in small pieces seemed to ease the weight, if only for an hour. The sheriff's office pursued digital traces with more care. They pulled records from the small camera Maya used on tours and asked local cell phone companies for call logs. The camera on the dock had a dead battery, but the files already uploaded to the cloud were examined and played slowly by technicians. Maya's last videos were mostly ordinary: birds, a family laughing, a boat wake that slipped like a ribbon across the screen. But investigators rewound and paused and watched frame by frame. Once, in a blur near a bank, someone had lifted a tarp. The shape under the tarp looked like metal. A deputy matched the time of that frame to interviews and notes. The silver case the witness had mentioned moved from rumor toward evidence. Some people chose to speak and then stop. Others began to look as if they were balancing a long secret. The men at the camp answered questions with short lines and shifting gaze. They spoke of hunting and maintenance and of a long route they had run for years. The sheriff sensed a stubborn wall of silence and set his people to find wiggles in that wall: small financial records, a receipt here, a plate number there. He asked for help from other agencies who had more resources for a complex case. Federal agents visited for a week, asked precise questions, and then left a card with a badge stamped on it. Their presence made the case larger and more official, but it also made the town nervous. Rumors hardened into a kind of pressure. People began to whisper about crates that had passed through the marsh, about goods that did not match local business, about men who paid cash and left quickly. A neighbor recalled one night seeing men lift a heavy case into a truck under the cover of rain. Another mentioned a license plate that began with a number like a pattern he could not place. Each hint was a small flashlight in a long hallway. The sheriff collected them patiently, lining them up to see if the pattern would show. For Miguel, the work took on an urgency that felt like promise and a cost. He pushed for more organized searches and tied bright ribbon tags to mangrove branches so teams could mark where they had been. He brought Elias out on a quiet morning and taught him how to read the water the way Maya had taught him, the way the wind bent a reed, the way a turtle's head broke the surface, the way birds cut a channel. In the thin light of dawn, Miguel let Elias hold the small camera and showed him how to point it without blinking. Elias filmed a heron and then looked at Miguel with the serious face of someone learning to keep a promise. The community tried to hold to the ordinary while the case pulled them to something larger. Small kindnesses kept showing up: meals, rides to school, a neighbor offering to cover utility bills for a month. But there were also days when the quiet felt heavy, and people closed their doors. Business owners near the docks fretted about customers noticing worry in the town. An airboat company donated time and fuel for searches, but each donated hour was a cost to their business. The conservation group that supplied cameras and volunteers began to worry that the marsh itself was being used as a roadway for things that did not belong there. One thin thread came months later that lifted a small piece of the fog: a man walking the bank of a canal found a nylon strap snagged on a root. It was small, bright, foolish seeming in the middle of gray marsh. He brought it to the sheriff. The strap carried a cartoon patch, something a child would choose. Elias looked at photographs of the strap and said, with a small, steady voice, "That's from my backpack." The sheriff logged it as evidence. The strap did not answer the big questions, but it insisted on being there, like a footstep that would not be ignored. Each new item, each call, each piece of cloth, each blurry frame from a camera kept people searching. It kept Miguel and Lena returning to the water. It nudged Jared from silence toward a harder honesty. It kept Elias believing in the small, stubborn hope that he could wake one morning and find his mother in the kitchen, humming as she packed his lunch. The marsh held its breath alongside them, and people learned that sometimes hope and patience are the same thing. The call came on a bright, sticky morning when the marsh smelled of heat and old leaves. A private landowner, Mr. Bennett, had been checking a patch of reed his dogs always liked to chase. The dogs would not return. He fired up his small gunboat and pushed into a narrow channel where the grass rose like a wall. There, in a small hummock of raised ground, he saw a large shape coiled in the sun. It was a python, heavy, long, and oddly swollen in the middle. The dogs cowered at the edge of the reeds. Mr. Bennett called the wildlife officers and kept his distance. By the time the officers arrived, Word had already spread through the county office. The Everglades were full of snakes, but a python that large and that round was not common. The team moved carefully. They wore sturdy gloves and used long poles and nets. The snake hissed softly and uncoiled enough to show how thick it was. One officer, a quiet woman named Dr. Hart, had worked with rescued reptiles for years. She could tell by the way the python breathed that it had eaten something unusually large. She ordered the snake to be sedated and carried into a padded crate for a slow and controlled trip to a nearby wildlife facility. At the facility, the python was placed in a warm, dark room with soft bedding. The staff watched and monitored its vitals. Pythons digest slowly. When they eat, they rest and wait. But this snake had a bulge that did not feel like meat or normal food. It was smooth and regular, as if something had been wrapped and swallowed whole. The vet, careful and steady, decided to try methods that would not harm the animal: gentle warmth, a calm environment, and time. The team set cameras and notes, because whatever the snake had swallowed could be important. 2 days passed. The staff fed the python a very small meal to encourage its digestive system, and they kept it warm and quiet. On the 3rd day, in the hush of the observation room, the python began to retch. It was slow and awful in a quiet way. The vet and the technicians stood by with trays and tools. The snake relaxed and pushed, and finally, with a wet, heavy slide, a soaked bundle came out and landed on the clean tray. Nobody in the room breathed for a moment. The bundle looked like a ruined backpack, waterlogged and full of swamp rot and time. They unwrapped the bundle with gloved hands. The zipper was rusted but still held. Inside were clothes that smelled of mud and salt. There was a small point-and-shoot camera, a tangle of cords, a ruined phone in a waterproof case, and a hard external drive wrapped in plastic. A nylon strap with a child's cartoon patch hung loose from a pocket. The technicians moved slowly, treating each item as if it might be a voice reaching across a distance. Someone took photographs. Someone else labeled bags. The items were placed in evidence boxes and the wildlife facility called the sheriff. When the sheriff's deputies opened the evidence room, the collection felt like a little life unpacked from the deep. Miguel was there, and Lena from the conservation group, and Jared from the docks. Elias listened to the news on the radio in the neighbor's trailer and pressed his forehead to the speaker until his ears filled with sound. When Mrs. Delgado put her hand on his shoulder and said the words "they found a backpack," he dropped the radio and felt the world both tilt and steady. The lab work began with small careful tasks. The nylon strap was swabbed for DNA. The hair stuck to the seams was tested. The phone was placed in a special dryer to wait for any data it might yield. The camera's memory was removed and read by technicians. But the hard drive, wrapped and dark, felt most like a promise. The technician who worked with drives was patient and used a clean room to remove the casing and read the folders slowly. When some files opened, the room settled like a crowd watching a screen. What they found first were short video clips, and one of them held a voice that made everyone in the room sit straighter. It was Maya. She spoke softly to the camera, like a person recording something private in a quiet corner. Her voice trembled sometimes, but there was a clear purpose in what she said. She spoke about strange shipments moving through the marsh at night. She said she had seen men load cages and silver cases into trucks. She described the sound of tarps being flapped open and the smell of diesel under the moon. Her voice told names of places and, in a low hurry, gave a license plate number for a truck. On the screen, she filmed a truck bumping over a mud road. In another clip, through grain and poor light, a man lifted a tarp and rows of cages showed like a bad dream. The footage was jagged and short in places. Some clips were close-ups of leaves and muddy boots. One clip ended with a sudden, loud noise and the image going dark. The lab paused it and listened to a breath, the sound of palms in the mud, a soft curse, then white noise. The room full of detectives and technicians felt the shape of a break in time, a moment when something rushed and stopped. None of the files showed a complete story. But together, the fragments made a map of danger and truth. Forensics compared the hair on the strap and the fibers in the backpack with a sample from Maya's old jacket that the sheriff had. The match came back as a strong one. The lab director, careful with his words, told the sheriff that the evidence tied the items to Maya. It was not the kind of proof that answered everything, but it was proof enough to move the case from rumor into fact. Elias sat in a small room after he heard the news and drew a picture of his mother with the sun behind her. He pressed the paper to his chest and whispered, "Mama, I see you." The discovery rippled fast. The sheriff called federal contacts. Conservation agents who fought animal trafficking flew to the county to examine the videos and the gear. The files suggested more than a local theft, they suggested a ring that used the marsh as a road and hidden staging area. Officials who had long suspected illegal trade in the region felt hope and anger at the same time. Mr. Bennett, who had found the python, went home and sat quietly on his porch. He did not like the idea of the marsh as a hiding place for crimes. He had come to love the land in his own way. The small camera footage was not perfect, but it showed the pattern of nightly movement, crates, cages, trucks with fresh tire tracks, and men who worked by the light of flashlights. Maya's voice had named a few who looked like small-time smugglers and given hints of buyers who came by private planes or by vans that ran on cash. The recordings suggested she had been collecting evidence and feared what she had found. In one clip she whispered into the camera that someone had agreed to meet her about the proof she had gathered and that she planned to hand over the files. In another she said she was afraid for Elias and asked the person watching to keep him safe if anything happened to her. The sheriff and investigators combed through these files, stopping and rewinding the same frames dozens of times. The governor's office was not involved yet, but the presence of a Fed liaison meant the case might cross county lines. For Miguel and Lena, the discovery felt like both a victory and a burden. They had the proof they needed to force questions. But the proof also made the danger real. If these men had taken one person and dared to move protected animals and goods, they might react to pressure by running, hiding, or worse. Elias sat in his neighbor's small kitchen and watched the news with trembling hands. He did not understand court dates or indictments. He only knew that a small plastic bag with Maya's handwriting was found inside a snake. He felt both sorrow and a thin thread of comfort that his mother had tried to fight something wrong. He kept the note she had left under his pillow and smoothed it with his thumb until the paper felt soft. In the evidence rooms and offices the work sped up. Subpoenas were prepared. Investigators began to trace the license plate Maya had filmed. Phone records and bank receipts were requested. People who had been quiet were asked again what they had seen. The men at the camp near the slough were not yet arrested, but they no longer moved through the town without eyes on them. The discovery of the python and the backpack had moved the case into a new stage, a place where small things had become a loud voice demanding answers. And in the marsh, where reeds bent and water shined like glass, life continued its slow, patient motion. Birds called, and turtles slid from logs. Yet for many, the Everglades had changed in the heart. It had revealed that it could hide secrets, but sometimes, in its own way, it could give them back. The evidence from the backpack and Maya's footage spread through the offices like a bright sound. Investigators took the small, broken files and began to follow the lines they showed. A license plate number seen in the grainy video led to a rental company. The rental company led to a paper trail of payments. Those payments led to a shell company that, on paper, was connected to a construction project a half hour from the marsh. The deputies and federal agents sat in quiet rooms and traced each step, as if they were laying out a path of footprints across a muddy field. Miguel and Lena watched the map of names and receipts grow. The conservation group shared what they had learned with the sheriff and with a federal wildlife task force. The task force had people who knew how to follow money and paper as well as tracks. They looked for connections: who bought the silver cases, who moved the cages, who paid in cash and why. The more they looked, the more the pattern widened. little companies and odd payments connected to a larger business. A warehouse outside town had records showing crates moved at night. A private airstrip outside the county had logs of a small cargo plane landing late and leaving early. Each fact pulled the case out of the marsh and into a larger world. Not everyone wanted the world to know. Some local voices hardened in defense of the men who had lived rough lives by the water. Others felt anger and shame that the marsh had been used in this way. The county official listed in the paper trail denied everything in a tight statement. The contractor whose name showed up on invoices said his company only handled legal work and that he had no knowledge of illegal shipments. Their denials sounded practiced. But when subpoenas went out and the investigators came with search warrants, people stopped pretending. Lawyers arrived with folders. Phone records came in. Bank statements arrived in thick envelopes. The air of a small town neighbors, favors, small debts grew uneasy. For Jared, the airboat guide, the change was personal and heavy. He had watched the men at the slough for months. He had told himself he would not get involved because trouble in the marsh could stay and return with a price. But when the videos showed a hand lifting the tarp and rows of cages, Jared felt a responsibility that would not let him sleep. He came forward. He sat with deputies and told what he had seen and when he had seen it. He described the silver case he had glimpsed and the way the men moved at night. His voice shook at first, but he kept speaking. His testimony was exactly the kind of local detail investigators needed. It gave faces and times to the maps made from paper. The men at the camp felt the pressure. Their truck stayed parked with a flat tire. Their movements tightened like a coil. Some of them hired lawyers. Some left town for a few days and then returned. A few who had small roles in the shipments decided to talk. Fear can make ordinary people do brave things, or it can make them turn on one another. In this case, a man who had helped load boxes into a van one night decided he could not live with the weight of what he had seen. He sat down with a federal agent and told a story that filled in blanks, the place where crates were stored, the number on the silver case Maya had filmed, the names that were used when money changed hands. He did not say everything at first. He said enough for agents to ask for more. The investigators began to find physical evidence in other places. At a warehouse under contract to a shell company, agents found cages that matched what was shown in Maya's footage. They found receipts and a ledger. The ledger had numbers and initials. It did not say clearly who the buyers were, but the pattern looked like a list. The investigators compared handwriting and matched it to a name on a contractor's paperwork. They traced shipments out of state by tracking shipping manifests and matching them to payments. It formed a loose chain: capture, transport, storage, shipment. It also formed a clearer picture of how the swamp had been used. The case evolved into several parts at once. One line of work focused on wildlife trafficking and illegal trade. These charges could be proven by matching animals, cages, and receipts. Another line of work focused on people who had moved goods and who had helped hide evidence. The sheriff and federal prosecutors knew that without a body they would need strong proof for any murder or worse charges. So they built cases that could stand on each part: trafficking, obstruction, conspiracy. Each successful charge would tighten the net and might reveal more. As the arrests began, they were quiet and final. Agents moved in at night to avoid alarm. Men were taken from houses, from trailers, and from work sites. Handcuffs clicked, doors opened, and agents read rights from voices that were steady and official. The men who had once felt they could do what they wanted in the dark now sat under bright lights and spoke to lawyers. Some pleaded not guilty. Others, when shown the evidence, changed their tune. A few confessed to small parts helping to lift boxes, watching the truck while others loaded. None of the confessions described details of what happened to Maya, but they did confirm that her filming had shown the truth about a trafficking network. The county felt both vindication and fear. People who had been silent now watched the news as it named companies and people. Shopkeepers shuttered windows for a day, then opened them again when the cameras left. The conservation group worked with federal agents to shut down routes and seize cages. They spoke publicly about the harm done to wildlife and how the swamp had become a pathway for illegal trade. There were long meetings with local officials about how to prevent this again, more patrols, better monitoring of private airstrips, and tougher checks at warehouses. Elias watched from the small house with Mrs. Delgado. He listened to the television as strands of the case unfolded in the news. He heard the word arrest and felt a small, sharp relief like a popped balloon. He did not yet understand all the legal words, but he knew that people had been taken away. He also heard other things: threats in the form of late-night calls to the sheriff, notes left anonymously at the park, and those made his small body tense. Miguel made sure Elias had someone to stay with him. He sat with the boy sometimes and showed him photographs of birds and taught him to watch how the water moved. He spoke to Elias in plain words about courage and waiting. The legal work was slow and careful. Prosecutors did not want loose holes in their cases. They built stacks of evidence: the backpack and its swift, wet path through a snake, the videos showing the boxes and the license plate, the ledger and the receipts, the men's voices in interviews. They prepared indictments for trafficking and conspiracy. They sent out more subpoenas for phone records and bank transfers. The men who had power in the county found themselves named in court papers. Some were forced to explain activities they had once called business. At town meetings, small groups argued about the best course. Some called for community healing and more resources for kids like Elias. Others demanded swift justice and tighter laws. The sheriff spoke without drama. He thanked the volunteers and urged patience, because justice moved with steps that could not be skipped. He also warned about the danger of revenge, of people taking the law into their own hands. The marsh had been the place where people had once settled disputes in secret; now, it would be watched. Through all this, the one hard truth remained: there was still no certain answer about Maya herself. The items from the backpack proved she had been close to danger and had tried to collect proof. The men's cooperation and the seized ledgers proved a trafficking network existed. Arrests put people behind bars. But the question that had started everything, what had happened to Maya on that day, still needed one final piece. For Elias, the movement of the case made a hollow place in his chest feel less empty sometimes. Each arrest was a step he could mark on the calendar. He drew lines and circles on paper and gave meaning to the days that passed. He still slept with Maya's note under his pillow. He still visited the marsh with Miguel when the day was soft and the birds were loud, because it felt, in a small way, like being closer to her. The community grew a little braver and a little more careful. People who had closed their doors now left them slightly ajar. Part of the work showed how small things could change a large map. A python that swallowed a backpack had set loose a line that reached into offices and warehouses. A shaky camera in a guide's hand had made a map of names. The marsh, which had been used as a hiding route, became a place where people learned to watch better. The case was no longer just a missing persons file in a sheriff's drawer. It had become a story that pulled in many hands and many questions. The net tightened around criminals and secrets, but the final truth about Maya waited like a quiet bend in the water, still unseen. For a long time the case lived in small, careful movements: calls returned, records pulled, interviews that began and then stopped. Then one morning a woman stepped into the sheriff's office with a hand that trembled and a story that had been heavy in her chest for a year. She worked at the private airstrip and had watched the trucks and crates come and go. She had been afraid. She had told herself silence was safer. But the arrests and the evidence had changed something in her, a long, slow guilt that finally made her speak. What she told the agents was small at first and then larger. She remembered a night when a woman had been brought to the airstrip. The woman had spoken in Spanish to a man who wore a plain shirt and called her mi hijo in a voice that sounded like it held a family secret. The woman had been bundled, not like a traveler, but like someone being moved quietly. The woman had a small bag that the woman at the airstrip now recognized from a grocery run. She remembered the sound of mud under tires and the way the night smelled of diesel and damp. Her words placed a person at a place and at a time. The agents listened, then pressed softly, and the woman gave them more, the name of the man who signed for a van, a partial plate number, and a small detail about a flat tire and a silver case. The new witness's memory gave investigators a fresh path. They followed the man's paper trail and found a salvage yard where his vehicle had been taken after a crash months earlier. Inside the wrecked truck they found a phone that had not been noticed before. Forensic technicians worked slowly and carefully with the device. It took time, but the phone eventually yielded messages and a string of calls that tied the man, Antonio Ruiz, to the camp near the slough and to people in the trafficking ring. The messages showed panic, money transfers, and instructions that fit the pattern the investigators had been building from Maya's clips. Putting the pieces together required patience and respect. The sheriff and federal agents returned to the marsh with search teams, this time with clearer directions. They waded into a bend of water where mud had been churned and where old tire tracks sank into the bank. They followed the path the evidence suggested. The search was slow and quiet, because they wanted to preserve anything they might find. Miguel stood at the edge and watched the men move with metal tools and slow hands. He felt the weight of all the small people who had kept quiet and the weight of one boy who waited at home. It took days of careful work, until finally the searchers found a shallow patch of raised ground covered in sawgrass and littered with bits of plastic and a torn piece of cloth. It was a place people walked past 100 times and did not see. The scientists used careful lifting techniques and, with respect, turned over each piece of ground until they found remains that could be identified. For Elias and for the county this was both an end and a new beginning, an end to not knowing and a beginning of sorrow and ceremony. The medical examiner worked with the utmost care and, using dental records and DNA, confirmed what everyone had feared: the remains belonged to Maya. When the sheriff told Elias, he sat very still and read the words on the paper until they pressed into him like cold. His small body seemed older at that moment, as if responsibility had moved inside him. Mrs. Delgado held his hand and let him cry in a way that was quiet and private. The telltale note he had kept under his pillow felt suddenly more like a promise than a paper. The confirmation did not make the pain less, but it changed the shape of mourning. Elias could now place a stone and a name. He could say that his mother had been found and that he had not been forgotten. The court work that followed used the new evidence to add charges. Some men pled guilty to trafficking and conspiracy when faced with the ledger, the crate receipts, Maya's footage, and witness testimony. Others went to trial. The trials were long and full of the kind of slow truths the law requires: records, receipts, ledgers, and witness statements. The men who had once moved through the marsh in secret sat in a courtroom and watched prosecutors lay out the path of money and boxes. Some were sent to prison for their part in the trafficking ring. The contractor and the county official who had been implicated were forced to answer for the parts they had played. The arrests and the convictions did not bring back what had been lost, but they changed the way business was done around the marsh. Agreements were revised, oversight increased, and private airstrips grew harder to use without scrutiny. In the small town, people reacted in different ways. Some felt relief that justice had moved forward. Some felt shame at how easily the swamp had been used for wrong. Friends and neighbors gathered to help Elias. The conservation group that had helped with evidence added funds and volunteers to better patrol sensitive parts of the Everglades. Miguel and his fellow rangers received equipment and training aimed at stopping illegal movement through the marsh. The community organized a small fund for children who had been affected by the trafficking, a gesture that, while small, reminded people that practical help can walk with sorrow. The python that had started so much, the snake that had swallowed a bag and brought it to the light, was treated like any animal that had been part of a strange story. After its role in the discovery, vets and conservationists found a sanctuary where it could live without danger and without being hunted. The doctors who had saved it released it to a place where its life could be about living, not evidence. Locals told the story sometimes with a hushed wonder, how a creature had carried a secret and given it back. For Elias, the snake became a symbol of how small things could change big stories. For Elias himself, life kept quietly moving forward. He lived with Mrs. Delgado for a time and then with an aunt who had always been close. School became steadier. He learned to draw birds with more care, and he kept a small notebook where he wrote down facts about the marsh and the names of flowers. He visited the small grave that the town arranged for Maya and left shells and small feathers. He learned to whistle like her and to keep the small things she had taught him. He did not forget the hard days, but he began to remember the good ones, the way she taught him to point out a heron's neck stretching in the morning, the little notes she left folded under a cup. Months later, the town gathered by the water for a modest memorial. People brought flowers and photographs, and they said things in turn about how Maya had worked and loved and fought. Lena spoke about courage and about how one person's careful watch can change many lives. Miguel spoke quietly about the land and its rights. The sheriff thanked volunteers and promised that they would keep working to protect the marsh and those who lived near it. Elias stood at the edge and felt the wind like a word that passed over him. He placed his note on a small pile of stones and stepped back, letting the moment be both private and shared. The case changed more than who sat in a courtroom. It taught the community something important about paying attention. Neighbors formed new watch groups for the docks. Conservationists worked with local officials to improve reporting lines. The county changed some rules about private airstrips and warehouses. People who had once pretended ignorance felt some need to do better. The change was not sudden and it was not perfect, but it was real. In the quiet that came after the trials and the searches, the memory of Maya lived in small things: a thermos left by someone at the dock, a child's cartoon strap that someone kept in a frame, a notebook in the library with a list of birds she had taught others to identify. For Elias, memory was a place he could go that was not only sorrow but also a room filled with lessons. He grew with the knowledge that his mother had tried to protect the swamp she loved and the life she had built for him. He grew with the knowledge that small acts, filming a truck, holding a camera, keeping notes, can be brave acts. Years later, when Elias was older, he would take a small boat out into the marsh and stop where the reeds cut the water like a wall. He would look at the place where the town had set stones and then look farther where sunlight made the water silver. He would feel both the weight of what had happened and the gentle promise that people can act when they see wrong. The Everglades kept its own rhythms, and people learned to listen better. Maya's story stayed with them, a story about a mother who tried to protect both her son and the wild place she loved, and about how small, patient truths can find their way back to the surface.